Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam sarvagam sarvam sarvabhutaguhashayam yat sarva vishayatitam tasmai sarvavide namaha. Very good. Nice to see you all today. And as you may know, we start a new chapter of our text, Upadesha Sahasri. This has really been quite, for me as a teacher, and hopefully for you as students, it's been a delightful study so far, and I have a feeling it's going to even get better. I think you'll like this chapter very much. So welcome. I forgot to welcome you all and also welcome our many students watching online. Chapter 13, there are, I think 18 chapters altogether. Chapter 13, achakshustva prakaranam, chakshus eye, achakshustva, literally eyelessness. It's a very peculiar kind of expression. It's actually the first word of the first verse. Shankara does that, and not only Shankara, many authors will do that. The title of each chapter is named after the first word of the chapter. And once again, this achakshus, this word and this teaching, and much of what we see in the opening portion of this chapter, comes once again from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. We've made many references in prior chapters. Shankara is drawing heavily upon that text, leading me to imagine that while he was composing this text, he was teaching or studying that chapter. And before we plunge in, I'd like to share with you the particular passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad on which this opening portion is based. We studied this many years, not many years ago, 5 years ago or so, maybe more. The portions, not the entire Upanishad, but portions. It's quite big, as you can see. And in the third chapter, some of you might remember that Janaka called all the great rishis of his time to his palace, and in his sabha, in his court, in his hall, he held a debate. In this debate, his primary guru, Yajnavalkya, was the kind of like the main person, and he was then debating others. So others would challenge Yajnavalkya in this debate style discussion. And one of the many debaters was Gargi, who is one of the few female rishis that we find in the Upanishads. Not the only one, but there are few. And by the way, if you think women in those ancient times were very shy and demure, not Gargi by any means. She was very vigorous in her argumentation. And perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps Yajnavalkya might have felt a little threatened by her at one point because, and we know this from Yajnavalkya's typical male response when he told Gargi, if you keep arguing like that, your head might fall off. To me, that suggests that he was a little bit put off by her forwardness, as it were. Anyway, this comes after that portion of the debate where Gargi asks him two more questions. I will cut out all the other stuff in response to the second of those two questions. the second one being both of them being about Brahman. And so in the response to the second question, Yajnavalkya replies, Saha uvacha. Yajnavalkya replied, what did he say? Etadvaitad aksharam Gargi. O Gargi, this is the immutable Brahman. Brahmanaha abhivadanti, as described by all the enlightened ones. And what is that Brahman? Listen to the description, and this is what the chapter opens with. Astulam ananu. That Brahman is not gross, nor is it subtle. Ahraswam adirgam. It is not short, it is not long. Alohitam. Brahman is not red. Asneham. Brahman is not oily. These may seem a little odd. Achayam atamaha. Brahman is not shadow nor darkness. Avayu anakasham. Brahman is not air or space. Asangam. Brahman has no attachment. Arasam agandham. There is no flavor or smell. Achakshushkam. And here's our reference right now. Brahman is eyeless, so to speak. A shrotram, a vak, has no ears, no organ of speech. A manaha, no mind. A tejaskam, no tejas, no brightness. A pranam, a mukham, no prana, no mouth. Mukham, atram, anantaram. Nothing is inside, abahyam. Nothing is outside. So this is the description by Yajnavalkya to Gargi about the nature of Brahman. Notice it's all negation. Every one of those words was a word of negation. And this is what we see several times in Shankara's text, where negation is the primary methodology used in Advaita Vedanta. As you've heard me say several times, Vedanta doesn't give you everything. Vedanta doesn't give you anything. Doesn't need to, because you already are everything. All Vedanta needs to do is take away your wrong conclusions that make you suffer. So therefore, negation is the primary prakriya, teaching methodology used in Advaita Vedanta. So with that introduction, we can begin our chapter 13. Achakshushtvana drishtir me, achakshushtvana drishtir me, tata shrotasya kashutihi, tata shrotasya kashutihi, avaktvanatu vaktasyad, avaktvanatu vaktasyad, amanastvan matih kutaha, amanastvan mati kutaha. Achakshustvat. We are breaking up the words. There were spelling changes due to grammatical rules of Sandhi. Achakshustvat. Because of the absence of the power of sight, because of the absence of eyes, we can take it. Na drishtihi me, for me. Na drishtihi, there is no sight. Because I have no eyes, therefore I cannot see. Now, who is speaking here? It's in the first person. Me, for me. So who is speaking here? There are two ways of interpreting it, maybe more. One way that we've seen before is a common rhetorical device to put words in the mouth of Atma. course, Atma has no mouth. Atma doesn't speak. If Atma had a mouth and could speak, Atma could truly say, I don't have any eyes. Consciousness has no eyes. But there's another way we can interpret this, and I think we've used this in a prior chapter as well. And Shankara speaking to, we can also take it as Shankara speaking to us in the first person, but then we have the little difficulty of when Shankara says me or I, exactly what does that me or I refer to? And I think in our very last chapter we discussed what we called the enlightened ahankara. Ahankara, remember, is self-concept, self-definition, the sense of being an individual. Let's stay with self-definition for right now. When you say, who am I? When you meet someone for this first time and you introduce yourself, how do you describe yourself? You know, I am this, I am that. You start with your name. Atma has a name? Atma is consciousness. Consciousness doesn't give a name. After you were born, your parents named who? They didn't give a name to Atma, consciousness. They gave a name to this little baby they were holding. That baby they were holding was a physical body. Not even much mind was present then, but the baby's body was a... So therefore, that name you were given is a name for your body, not a name for consciousness. So, when Shankara uses I, he uses it in a very different way than most people. The unenlightened ahankara is based on complete identification with the body and mind. I am male, I am old, I am bright, I am dull, etc. Identification with the body and mind. But for an enlightened person, as Sri Shankara, the usage of the word I is unconventional. Remember, we said, when we discussed this enlightened ahankara, unconventional doesn't mean you become allergic to the word I, and you start using this artificial language. This came into the hall 10 minutes ago to teach. This is tired today. That's unnecessary to use that. If you're really enlightened, why do you need to resort to such artificial language? So the enlightened person uses the word I, but in a very different way. The enlightened person uses the word I, knowing full well that his or her true nature is consciousness, sat-chit-ananda, atma. So it's enlightenment means that you should understand, and certainly you can understand the difference between consciousness and body, mind, and senses, and the enlightened person can say, I in either sense. Why not? Have the mental agility to use the word I in the sense of one's true nature. We'll use the word swarupa. Swarupa means true nature, essential nature. So the word I could be used by Shankara in the sense of swarupa. I am sat-chit-ananda atma. And also the same word I can be used in a very empirical manner. I am teaching. I am hungry, I am tired, etc. So an enlightened person is smart enough to figure out both and use I in various ways. We have this weird word ambidextrous, being able to use left hand equally well as right hand. So we could say that the enlightened person, this sounds funny, an enlightened person has an ambidextrous ego. You get the sense? That is, that the word I can refer to Swarupa, true self, Atma, or the word I can refer to body, mind, senses in a very ordinary way. Shankara opens this text. We'll interpret it in this manner. Shankara is speaking to us using the word I, using it ambidextrously, here referring to his true nature, sat-chit-ananda atma. So Shankara says, as sat-chit-ananda atma, a chakshus tvat, because I have no eyes, therefore, na drishtihi me, therefore I have no sight. And you saw that a chakshus come from the Upanishad. That's how we begin. Also, much of what follows also comes from that long statement of negation. So like in the next line, tata, in the same way, ashrotasya, for one without ears, atma, ka shutihi, how can there be hearing? Avaktvat, because I have no mouth, na vaktihi syat, there's no possibility of speech. Amanastvat, and because I have no mind. Shankara says, I am mindless, obviously referring to swarupa, true nature. Because I have no mind, matihi kutaha, how could there be thinking? How could there be thought? So here we see, it's also very poetic. I actually like this style quite a bit, where some poetic device is used. I think because poetry has a way of reaching us in a way that prose doesn't. Of course, these are verses, but verses in a technical text are not highly poetic. Most verses in technical texts are not very poetic at all. These happen to be quite poetic, and I think that touches us in a different way. Before we go on, let's just remember some of the important logic that underlies this process of negation. And that logic has to do with a discernment between subject and object. Anything known to you is not you. Simple. Anything known to you is not you. And based on that very simple principle, it's amazing how far you can go just with that one prakriya, that one teaching methodology. Anything known to you is not you. Eyes and power of sight are known to you. Ears and power of hearing are known to you. Mouth and power of speech, mind and thoughts are all known to you. Anything known to you is not you. Now, we can take a variation of this logic and say they are all, in common language, you say, my ears, my hearing, my mouth, my power of speech, etc. So we put it in a possessive sense frequently. A little different than subject-object. So we can do the analysis in terms of subject-object. We can do the same analysis in terms of possessor and possessed. Anything possessed is different from the possessor. So similar to the subject-object. You possess a body. You possess ears. You possess the power of hearing. Notice they're different. You possess eyes. You possess the power of sight, etc. You possess mind. You possess the power of thinking. Here's a central question. Do you possess consciousness? And this is a tricky question. Do you possess consciousness in the same way as you possess the power of sight? Let's take that. So you possess the power of sight, you possess the power of consciousness. In fact, it's in outside of Advaita Vedanta, in other forms of Advaita, especially in Yoga Vasishta, they talk all the time of chit-shakti is a term used, the power of consciousness. It's a little misleading, and I'll show you why. In Advaita Vedanta, we tend not to use that expression, chit-shakti, but if you start reading materials outside of the standard literature of Advaita Vedanta, in particular, if you were to study this great text, Yoga Vasishta, you'll find that term used extensively, chit-shakti. Is chit a shakti? Is it a power you possess? It literally means a power of consciousness. Is consciousness a power you possess and wield, just like you possess and wield the power of sight? Now, the way we proceed is this technical word, anvaya vyatireka, presence and absence. This is a technical tool we use, and I'll spare you all the boring details and just show you how it works. In the absence of the power of sight, do you, the possessor of the power of sight, still exist? Obviously. You can be blind. And if you're blind, you don't have the power of sight, but most certainly you exist. You exist as a blind person. Good. Now, your existence is independent of the power of sight. Now apply that to consciousness. In the absence of consciousness, do you exist? That's interesting. In the absence of consciousness, your existence has no meaning, because our fundamental definition of who you are is a awareful being, conscious being. If you're not a conscious being, you don't exist. If you're not conscious, in the absence of consciousness, there is no existence. What that logic does is it establishes that consciousness is not something you possess. First we saw consciousness is not an object, it's the subject. Now we're saying consciousness is not an possession. You don't possess consciousness, but rather you are consciousness. And I've made this comment in many classes before, and that is, when I teach, I frequently use the term your consciousness. It's a convenient expression to use, but apply our discussion to that. Your consciousness, the consciousness that you possess, right? So I will continue to use the term your consciousness. It is very convenient and meaningful. But notice, when we examine that expression very carefully, there's no your consciousness, there's no my consciousness, there's only consciousness. That's the ultimate teaching of Advaita Vedanta. Let's continue. Apranasya na karmasti, apranasya na karmasti, buddhya bhave na vedita, buddhya bhave na vedita, vidya vidyeta to nastaha, vidya vidyeta to nastaha, chenmatra jyotisho mama, chenmatra jyotisho mama. Staha becomes stash before chinmatra. Okay, staha is a verb, dual verb. Okay, the poetry continues here. Shankara speaking to us in the first person. Apranasya, for me, the one who has no prana, no life force, na karma asti. There can be no activity, no action. Buddhi abhave, we have to break the words. Buddhi abhave, in the absence of buddhi, intellect. Na vedita, for me there is no knowing, no knowledge in the absence of buddhi. And in the absence of buddhi, tataha, in the third line, because there's no buddhi, tataha, therefore, vidya and avidya, knowledge and ignorance, na staha. There's our dual verb. They don't exist. Vidya and avidya. And here, there's a little tricky usage of the word vidya here. Vidya or jnana can, typically we use those words in a sense of knowledge about something. But in Vedanta, vidya, do you know what? I'm going to leave that aside because that really applies to jnana, not vidya. So let me back off on that. I think there's a mistake in what I was about to say. We'll set that aside. Vidya and avidya, knowledge and ignorance, tataha, for that reason, don't exist. Why? If there's no buddhi, if there's no intellect, intellect is the locus of ignorance and knowledge. If there's no locus, there's no Sorry, this says